What do most people misunderstand about language according to your work?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. I think the main thing they misunderstand is that language is some kind of external affair that we kind of come approximate to during acquisition and childhood. Like it's some kind of external, grounded set of rules that we become familiar with, as opposed to language developing the same way like any other internal organ develops, like a cognitive organ or bodily organ. Um, you don't have the way that your visual system develops, your auditory system. There's no such thing as the English visual system, for example, right? Like there's just the visual system. And that's true also of language, right? We just have a language capacity or a general language faculty that most of which is potentially exposed during environmental training and childhood, but a decent portion of it is likely to be innate. So the most basic, like primitive capacity of language is the ability to compose elements into hierarchically structured expressions, and then map those onto particular interpretations. So you can put like an object together with another object, and then you can put that together with a third object, and then you can kind of categorize that as a particular set, like a verb phrase, like an event, or a noun phrase, an entity. And you can do that very flexibly. So, but that's an internal mental property. There's nothing about so for example, different words have different like selectional and syntactic, properties. Like verbs will have different selectional properties about what they select with, what arguments they select. Um, but that's not a property of the environment. That's not an environmental feature out there in the world. It's not the kind of thing that a physicist could, in principle, identify. Um, so I think, all those linguistic details are not quirks of the environment. They are quirks of the human mind. And you can describe the same situation using multiple different kind of phrasal configurations. So, the killing of Bill. Bill was killed. The death of Bill, John killed Bill. The word killing is doing a lot of work there. Sometimes it acts as a noun, sometimes it acts as a verb. You can do a lot of different types of normalization procedures to frame it in different ways. But the point is that it's the same general concept. So the main thing that is often misunderstood about language is that it is not something out there that humans just become accustomed with in the same way that, and I think a lot of this comes from the kind of, schoolboy type of prescriptivism sort of logic. The idea that there is a proper way to speak English, there is the right way to speak English and the wrong way to speak English. Those are kind of societal norms that we have for how to communicate and how to write and express our feelings and how to compose novels and letters and speeches. But those are not like cognitive statements. They're not kind of psychologically legitimate
Mm.
factors of the human mind. They're just arbitrary biases that we happen to have for whatever reason. And that's not to say that it's not a good thing that we have speaking standards and manners and all the rest of it. I think that's a very good thing that we do have those things, but they're not properties of psychology. Like the property of psychology that is like a biological property is just this ability to extract compositional meanings from our own internal mental representations and then to express them in some way. And the crucial point that I want to stress here really is that when you do language, you're basically providing instructions to your conceptual systems using little strings, acoustic or non-acoustic orthographic strings, but then you reassemble them in very different ways. So, for example, just to give you some really easy examples here, something like old men and women, that can be parsed as old men and women, where old takes scope over both men and women, or it can be parsed as old men and women, in which case women can be young, they can be old. There's nothing in the linear string, the kind of physical environmental stimulus that you're getting, that helps you recover those meanings. And there's a lot of cases of structural ambiguity, like I watched a movie with Alec Baldwin. That can mean that you sat next to Alec Baldwin and you watched the movie together, or it can mean that you watched a movie and Alec Baldwin wasn't in the room with you, but he was on the screen. Those sorts of interpretations cannot be recovered from the environment. They have to be inferred. They have to be actively inferred, to use a kind of Fristonian term. And those sorts of active engagements, creative engagements are what language is really about. It's not about, and this kind of really speaks against some of the more traditional behaviorist intuitions. I mean, you have a economics background, you'll know a lot about behavioral economics and behavioral psychology. A lot of these ideas are kind of associationist. The idea that people learn words because they just hear a word in the environment and they associate it with a particular thing, and then it's just a nice isomorphic, mapping between the environmental stimuli and some kind of complex concept in their head. So that doesn't seem to work either. And the reason why I say a lot of this stuff is innate is for two reasons. There's kind of two main arguments for the innateness.
Well, so let's get to that, but can I just clarify? So it's interesting, like before you were saying you could say a word like kill and it has noun, it could be used as a verb though, or you had that sentence, the old men and women. So you could say the old men and women, like referring to the men and women that are old, or you could say the old men and woman. Like there's all these different. So how do we understand those things? And would you say that that's a separate question, how we understand it, given that, like, are you basically kind of saying then language is something different then? Like, what language is this? And just tell me more about that.
No, that's a really good question. It's a hard question to draw the boundary about what is a linguistic inference and linguistic process and what is a non-linguistic process. People have lots of different opinions about this, and most of the difficult debates in linguistics basically come down to people drawing the boundary in different places. Some people will be more kind of holistic and kind of define language processing as basically everything under the hood of a sentence. Other people, like me, will be a little bit more selective and only really define language processing as properties of inference and representation that are domain specific to the faculty of language. So that would be, for example, the proprietary representations. So those are elementary morphemic elements like nouns and verbs, right? Functional elements, the kind of individual parts, the things that you manipulate. But then there's also the proprietary computations, right? So there's representations and there's computations. Like there are entities and there are things you do with the entities. That's a basic metaphysical distinction between objects and their properties and events. So the proprietary computations seem to be this kind of hierarchical phrase structure representation, whereby, like I said, something like old men and women, the kind of structural ambiguity of old men and women is not to be found in non-linguistic domains. So to give you a clear example, music, mathematics, geometric reasoning too, spatial reasoning, they really tolerate symmetry. They can afford a lot of rich types of interesting symmetries. Human language doesn't really like symmetry. Whenever you have two elements together and you merge them together into a set, one of them always wins and becomes the head of what's called the head of the phrase, the thing that determines its distribution of properties and its interpretation. Interpretation meaning the way that, you can have the word kill, but the way you merge it together and frame it and contextualize it with other entities around it, other elements, that will determine its global compositional meaning. So that kind of peculiarity about language, that it's a kind of symmetry breaking mechanism, where in music you can have symmetry, natural numbers, lots of different mathematical and geometric properties allow symmetry. Human language doesn't really like symmetry. That seems to be a unique type of element of human language. And there are lots of other kind of distinguishing features of it. So that's the kind of structural distinguishing feature. Another distinguishing feature about language, which is something that Professor Chomsky's talked about for a long time, but it's a really important point that needs to be stressed. And that's the kind of independence of language and thought from the external environment. We have a lot of intuitions. I mean, humans have all sorts of intuitions that are often wrong about lots of things. As you know, in economics, this is very, very readily apparent, right? Also in language too, where we have intuitions that the words that we have somehow intrinsically refer to sets of things in the world. That there's like a necessary connection between when I say, gold or water or laptop, that there is something out there in the external world that a physicist could in principle maybe identify. But that it turns out to be wrong, even for the simplest cases. Like, for example, a book. If you say, if you go into a library and there are 2,000 physical books, but there are multiple copies of the same book, there'll be like 10 copies of the Bible. If you say John read every book that John read and then burned down every book in the library, the question is how many books did he read and how many books did he burn down? Well, you can count them differently. You can count the number of physical books, or you can just count the number of abstract, actual pieces of information. And lots of nouns are composed of these distinct senses that are actually ontologically kind of incompatible. So it seems strange to think of there being something in the world that is simultaneously an event or a piece of information, but also a physical quantity. That doesn't seem right? Like if you were to try and write a semantic system or design some kind of metaphysics, it would seem strange. You would want to have your events over here and your entities over here. And you can mix and match them together in compositional structures, but it seems weird to have that within a single word. A single entity could be conceived simultaneously as a abstract piece of information, but also a physical object. So newspaper too, right? You can say, there are 3 copies of the Times or the Guardian on the table, but they could each be either of the same week, or maybe one was from a couple of years old. But you can still refer to it as the newspaper. You can say things like the newspaper that's on the table offered me a job, right? And it wouldn't be the actual physical newspaper that offered you a job. It would be the Guardian that offered you a job. And the way that we mix and match these sorts of abstract and concrete features, we do it reflexively and we don't even think about it. It's just so obvious that we don't even think it's a problem. We don't think it's particularly in fact, a lot of philosophers don't think it's of much import to philosophy of language, but it really is. The fact that these common basic forms of polysemy meaning, like multiple meanings, the rich polysemy of human language is a real mystery. And I think Chomsky is right in stressing that the rich degree of polysemy that we have with even simple words really speaks against this idea that when we learn language, and what language is just something out there that we move towards.
Like, would you say that language, in your view, is then more powerful than we normally think? In that, so, like, would you distinguish it from there's like a kind of dictionary or vocabulary that we could learn as like when we're younger, and we know this word refers to that, and we learn like the idiosyncrasies of the grammar of the language we learn. But that's kind of a bit. But then when you give these strange examples of like the actually like quite deep sophistication of how do we refer to a physical book like the paper and what have you, but then it's also an abstract entity, and we're kind of like mixing them up, but then we can like quite quickly and easily distinguish them sometimes. And so is that in the language, is something different about language that you're kind of pointing to? Like,
I would say that's probably the most like the central question in modern semantics and syntax semantics. The question is, how much of the mind does language carve out? I have written a bunch of papers about this. I think it's unlikely that the full suite of conceptual representations that language manipulates are necessarily human specific and what came about when language emerged. I think what more likely happened is that in other primates, there are certain conceptual capacities, like the ability to think of physical objects, or like the ability to think of pieces of information or events, that are kind of encapsulated and don't speak to each other in the minds of non-human primates. They have those faculties, but they don't have any interesting transactions between those faculties. They're kind of separated and guarded from each other. And then when human language comes along, you have the ability to suddenly talk about happy, green, marshmallow horses on Mars. Right? You can just put together random concepts, right? And if you're someone like Noel Fielding or Stuart Lee, your whole career is based on this ability to just put concepts together that have never been put together before, right? And that kind of fundamental creativity is something that Chomsky, again, really used to highlight for a good reason, because that is the fundamental kind of architecture of human language, is the ability to put 2 or 3 or 4 things together that have never been put together in the entire history of human communication. Just a completely novel sentence that no one's ever said or thought about. But then not just some kind of artifactual, creativity in a kind of arbitrary, unconstrained way, to do it in a way that is actually formally highly constrained. Highly constrained meaning the rules of grammar and the rules of semantics too, by the way, are rules, right? You can violate them. There are certain meanings you can express that don't make any sense. There are certain sentences you can say that are complete gobbledygook, But if you slightly reconfigure them, suddenly it becomes poetry or it becomes a metaphor. So there's a very kind of thin line. We often don't navigate outside this canalized route of interpretation because people don't go around speaking a Joycean, Finnegan's Wake style language all day. We just speak in our usual English. But there's a very surprisingly fine space of all conceptually possible combinations and all grammatically possible expressions that humans inhabit. So we inhabit this very small slice of the computational universe that language affords us to navigate through. But there are many other possible ways of conceptual navigation. So I think what's novel about language from this kind of Turing theoretic, kind of computational universe, Stephen Wolfram type of perspective, is that it allows us to navigate new paths in conceptual space that otherwise would not be navigated. And I think that's a really interesting way to frame the evolution of language and the nature of language. And I think it has more evidence in its favor than other theories of language that kind of view language as primarily a tool for social grooming or communication, and all the rest of it.
Yeah, I remember in some of your talks you giving examples of sentences which kind of sound they sound plausible, they sound kind of complex, and like but then they mean nothing. I would like to say them some because I find it interesting. Yeah, to like you can contrast with that. There's some way to combine language that sound kind of okay but it's kind of using the power of language, but like again, all that you can have incredible poetry and actually mean something, even though it's like very precise and a bit odd that you could like conceptually go in that space. Like a good poet can move you through, but you actually can. On the other hand, like these other what are these sentences? I'm trying to remember them. That don't make sense.
Well, there are sentences that are there are Jabberwocky sentences that you replace all of the content words with fake words, but there are other sentences where you actually have all real English words and they're also grammatical, but they're just semantically surreal, like the kind of Noel Fielding sentences I mentioned, right? Like sentences that are good English and they're also real words, but they just are kind of a little bit like that's a surreal Joycean interpretation type of thing, right?
I see. What was it about? There was a sentence you had about going to Russia, or like something about you.
Oh yeah, no, that's right. That's a good one. Sorry, that's a good one. So you can say sentences like, "More people have been to Russia than I have," which now doesn't sound bad to me. That sounds really bad to me because I've thought about it so much. But when I first encountered those sentences, and those are about kind of quantification, like individual singular entities versus grouped entities. Grammatically, it kind of sounds like it flows quite well. But then when you think about the compositional semantics of the whole sentence, it's weird. So more people is a fine phrase. That's nothing wrong with that. More people have been to Russia. That's also okay. But then you contrast a set of people with an individual, right? That makes no sense. You can't compare those quantities, right? So the individual phrasal meaning, I guess, even at the phrasal level, is kind of okay. But then the sentence level, there's a violation. And those sorts of violations, and it's also true for grammatical sentences too. Sometimes there are things like, some commonly discussed cases are the keys to the cabinet are on the table. That's actually a good sentence. But sometimes people will say the keys to the cabinet is on the table, or the key to the cabinet are on the table. And sometimes you don't notice those errors because you kind of just understand what's being said, but you don't realize there's a violation. And there are other sentences which kind of have a similar property, right? You can have this kind of grammatical, ungrammatical, meaningful, meaningless, easy to parse, difficult to parse, kind of three-dimensional space that you can occupy. The difficult to parse but grammatical sentences are something like. So I'm going to give you a sentence which is fully grammatical in English, and it has a real interpretation. It's a fine sentence, nothing wrong with it. If you say the horse raced past the barn, fell, right? The horse raced past the barn, fell. Potentially sounds a bit strange. In English and in other languages, we have what's called an agent first bias, which is whenever you hear a noun in a sentence, you're going to assume that the noun is the agent. You just assume if I say Elliot, then Elliot is going to be the agent, right? It's less common to then say Elliot, was kicked by Bill. It's more common to say Bill kicked Elliot, right? So in the case of the horse raced past the barn fell, again, you assume that the horse is the agent. The horse raced, right? The horse is racing, the horse is doing something. But then if you think about it in terms of the horse that was raced by John past the barn fell, then it makes sense. But in English, you can elide and drop complementizers and other elements too. And you can kind of compress the meaning, but you can still recover it. So the horse raced past the barn fell literally means the horse that was raced past the barn by Jimmy fell over. So the horse still fell. So the horse is doing the falling, but it's not doing the racing, right? It sounds like the horse is doing the racing, but it's not. It's this implicit agent that's doing the racing. And there's all sorts of sentences like that. You know, there's famous examples where you can say, how many animals did Moses bring on the ark, right? And people always say, you know, 2. But of course, if I said Moses, I didn't say Noah, right? Like, you know, there are lots of obvious cases where you can kind of the global context can kind of disguise individual meanings, and that's. But going back to your question earlier about where, you know, what is that? I think a lot of that is more kind of what's called performance related. It's about the psychology of language. It's about the fact that human language and memory and attention has a lot of quirks and limitations, right? So you can imagine the human language system being taken out of the human brain and put inside an organism that had, you know, a very powerful memory and very powerful attention, and that would be a very different performance, right? It would be the same underlying architecture, the same constraints and rules, and the same representations available to you, the same number of, you know, 30 odd phonemes that, you know, the English language has, that we have, and the same number of semantic domains and representations, but it would be a different kind of beast.
Yeah. Like with these examples, say with the more people been to Russia than I have, doesn't actually mean anything. Like, it's not more people. What does that? Yeah.
Yeah.
Think about it now. But is that due to the power of language that, like, yeah, that it can be it's so incredibly useful in some situations, but then, like, it kind of, like, the ease by which we understand it kind of means, sometimes, like, it can mess with us, because actually even the way when you said that the sentence, it reminds me of, like, sometimes you can hear politicians and they can say stuff and it all makes sense and they can say it very confidently, but then you're like, if you, like, were to reflect on it, what did they say? What do they actually mean? Like, maybe they kind of said, like, kind of nonsense on a high level of semantic, like, space. It's like, this actually doesn't really refer to that much in the world. Like what? Okay, like, language can do this, but I mean, that's slightly different. Like, because I guess the more people went to Russia than me is just it's just nonsense. But yeah.
No, I think you're making a good point though, because so there was Richard Dawkins is these days kind of the arch neo-Darwinian synthesis gradualist type of, you know, philosopher of biology, right? He believes in natural selection being the most powerful you know, tool in explanatory evolutionary power, right? It explains the most things. It gets you what you want in terms of design, organismal design. There are other people in the field, including me, who think that natural selection has its place and is very powerful, but there are other types of forces driving evolution. Oops.
It's okay. Turn it on.
My light just went off. And that's a legitimate debate to have. But one of the interesting things about Dawkins is that in the 70s, before he became famous for selfish gene and other things, he wrote some papers about communication and language as well. And he had this really interesting idea that the evolution of language, following the way that other species use communication systems, may not be primarily in the game of expressing truth and helping to communicate, right? It might actually be also well designed and well placed and well selected for in terms of its ability to lie and to manipulate and to deceive and to misdirect. The capacity for human language for manipulation and deception is unmatched, right? That's why we have Shakespeare plays. That's why we have HBO dramas, right? Like, human language is the best thing there is when it comes to ambiguity, subtle misdirection, emotional manipulation, deceit. it's fantastic for that. Is it all that good at direct, clear, unambiguous communication? Not really. It's much better at deception, way better at deception. And Dawkins had this idea that, yes, maybe there's some kind of communicative force that was selected for language, but alongside that communication, because of the formal nature of the semantic space, and also the grammatical space that language inhabits, it just intrinsically gives you a lot of other abilities as well. So I think that's not a trivial point you're making. Like it's literally part of the game for language to. So, for example, the ones I mentioned, language is not just in the game of like linear, sequential, pure information theoretic type of reconstruction of messages. It's not just like, here's X, I'm going to communicate X. There's a lot of other things going on as well. And that's what makes it so cognitively demanding and challenging, because it's whenever you do sentence processing, you're also doing loads of other things too. You're doing world knowledge, situation model construction, pragmatic reasoning, social reasoning, and also the idea that language evolved for communication or is unique for communication also completely ignores the fact that we human beings communicate in the way we dress, our hairstyle, and the way we speak, the way we walk. That human beings communicate in all sorts of different ways, in very subtle ways too. We don't just communicate to each other using our words. So the space of communication is much more complex, and the space of thinking is also much more complex. And one of the things that really kind of annoys me about contemporary linguistics is the kind of obsession that we don't challenge our intuitions about what language is. In other sciences, we do that all the time. It's very common, and that's why they've made advances, because other sciences, physics, chemistry, have said, look, we have intuitions about gravity, we have intuitions about speed and mass. It turns out they're all wrong. Our intuitions about everything are completely wrong in physics. But that's also true for psychology of language, by the way. Like our intuitions about language being out there, our intuitions about words referring, our intuitions about grammatical, development and competence. All those things are completely wrong. And why would they be right? It would be very strange if our intuitions about language were just like correct. Like they gave us scientific theories. Like I don't think so. It's more complicated than that. So the biggest, my biggest complaint at the moment, I would say, is especially in the cognitive neurosciences, people who study the brain, how the brain processes language. The easiest way to study language in the brain is just to assume that language is doing pretty much what large language models are doing, and that's like next token prediction, right? It's inherently in the game of let's predict the next word, or maybe the word after that, and the word after that. If you do that, and you assume theoretically that language is this kind of predictive processing mechanism, then you will definitely find brain regions that light up, and show sensitivity to next token prediction and violations of linguistic predictions and surprisal scores, right? This word's low frequency. This word's high frequency. This sentence is novel. This sentence is not novel. And the problem then is that because you find these neural effects of language prediction, you then use that to go back and reinforce and say, yes, and you pat yourself on the back and say, well, I was right all along. Language must be inherently a predictive, mechanism because I found effects of language prediction in the brain. But just because you found those effects doesn't mean they're necessarily the right effects that you should be looking for, right? If you define language as basically next token prediction, then sure, you can find effects of that in the brain. On the other hand, if you define language the way that Professor Chomsky defines it, and other people, who follow his in that tradition, like me, it's much more difficult to find effects of language in the brain. It's much more difficult, but that doesn't mean they're not there. It doesn't mean those effects shouldn't be chased after, right? It just means that it requires a little bit more thinking.
Yeah, I know you have some work thinking about language, and they're not really being maybe a language center only. Or like there's different parts of the brain in concert. Like I talked with what's his name, Michael Anderson, of like neural reuse as well. So he's not about language in particular, but like it's actually tricky because he does think that there really isn't like a brain region for memory, a brain region for language, or what have you. But you might think it is if you do like simplistic neuroscience, because you sort of like knock out a region of the brain and you go, oh look, language stopped, oh
Yes.
memory stopped. But
Right.
it actually
Right.
really but did those really cause? Are they actually the most fundamental factors like delivering the result of those faculties? Actually, like not necessarily.
No, that's a very, very good point, and in fact, that's a point that's currently being debated in the literature over the last couple of years. The one that you've just mentioned. So it's completely true that if you and the work that I've done in our lab here in Texas, we get to use intracranial stimulation. Patients with epilepsy have electrodes inside their brain, and we can record, but also induce a small current and perturb kind of a temporary lesion in that small part of the brain that the electrode is in, and that can give you quasi-causal evidence. So you stimulate an electrode in Broca's area, and the patient is then unable to express language. And then you say, well, there's a causal role for this part of the brain in language. Likely, yes, but even in that case, just because you perturb a part of the brain doesn't actually mean that brain is the most causal or the primary involver in that computation. Reason being, you don't know if it's that specific computation that's been disrupted or some other secondary computation, right? So, for example, in language expression, there's all sorts of reasons why patients might not be able to say things, right? Their language might be disrupted, but also non-linguistic faculties may be disrupted too to stop them. And conversely, if I stimulate an electrode in parietal cortex and there's no apparent functional disruption of behavior and the patient is still able to do the task, that doesn't actually mean that electrode is not involved in the computation. It just means that some other part of the brain can help out to compensate, right? So this kind of simple 2x2 of like, it's a real, I think, problem to binarize. First of all, binarize complex cognitive tasks as 1 or 0. The patient either performs a task or they don't. Second, because like I said, that presupposes that the precise computational dimension that's being disrupted that can explain this complex behavior, right? So there's a set of simple computations that can explain a complex behavior like speech or auditory repetition. A patient repeats a sentence. There's all sorts of ways you can frame that. So it's a problem to binarize it as 1 or 0. And there are some interesting recent papers that are trying to push back against that more simple localizationist model of we stimulate this electrode, it knocks out a function. But like I said, conversely, if you don't stimulate an electrode, if you do stimulate an electrode and there's no dropout in function, it doesn't tell you all that much. It tells you that in this particular context, in this particular paradigm, in this particular patient, this brain region wasn't necessarily recruited, as far as we know, but it still could have been recruited, but then subferred, as you said before, right? Some other parts of the brain can help out and save the day at the last minute. So what we really need is much more of a kind of, a fine-grained resolution picture in this kind of stimulation space, where yes, you can stimulate the brain, but you do it over smaller time windows, maybe, and then you get a better picture, or rather, you stimulate in addition, this electrode, and then this one immediately after, and vice versa, or this one, then this one. So you can do kind of stimulation parameters with epilepsy patients that afford a little bit more causal precision. Instead of just stimulating an electrode for like 3 seconds, and then that's it, and then saying this region does language, you can really make a more carefully defined map about this part of the brain is involved early on in the computation, and then this part, and then this part. And if you knock out this part, then this part takes over. And if you don't knock out this part, then this, etc., etc. You can draw a much more interesting map.
Yeah, so it reminds me of when you have talked about elderly patients. One can often say, oh, they've lost the capacity for language, but then you're kind of skeptical about it to a degree, in that it's like, well, what exactly was lost, right? Because sometimes you can not be able to speak, right? But does that mean that you and related to that, and tell me if I'm right, if I'm understanding your work correctly, language is in some way more quite fundamental and isn't just located in one faculty of the brain, and so it wouldn't really make sense for it to like be knocked out, because it's not just, language is not just something we add on top. Like we use it to communicate in the world. It's actually like it's very core. We actually use it within our mind. Like it's something to do with combining loads of different things like logic, and it has a kind of a sophisticated structure. I mean, still weird. I'm still trying to understand, like, then given your work, what actually is language, and it's like how to think about it. But yeah.
Yeah, you can. There are parts of the brain, like the posterior temporal cortex, that get you close to knocking out the basic property of language. This compositional, hierarchical, merge-based operator that groups things together and then structures it into a hierarchical category. That gets you close. But still, even in those cases, what I call paragrammatic patients, that kind of produce jumbled, sentences that don't really seem to make much sense, you still get hints of composition every now and then. So it's not as if you can completely get rid of it. And I think the reason why you can't completely get rid of it is because you either have it or you don't, type of thing. This kind of goes back to my critique of the gradualist idea, that language evolved gradually, incrementally, in the kind of traditional, hill climbing metaphor of natural selection. The reason why that probably didn't happen is that the core property of language is binary. It's just, in fact, I gave some talks recently reviewing some of these ideas, but you either have discrete infinity, the capacity to build unbounded, potentially infinite discrete structures, right? The natural numbers, the successor function, right? That's kind of the basis of linguistic recursion. You either have that or you don't. It's not as if you can do it, half the way or 75% of the way. It's a kind of a phase transition in intelligence, in simian intelligence, right? And there are some people who've tried to explain that capacity from a gradualist perspective. They've tried to say, well, maybe you can put two words together, and then maybe 50,000 years later, primates, Homo sapiens sapiens, could put four words together and then maybe five words together, as if it's just like a capacity restriction. It's just a working memory capacity restriction or an attentional restriction. And we know that's not true, because there is no relationship between the statistical distribution of words and sentences and their distributional properties and grammatical inferences. Right? Grammatical inferences are a separate realm. They often, sometimes overlap with word combinations that are not common, but not in principle. No, in principle, they are separate things, right? So you can't just take the statistics of language and map it directly onto grammaticality, which is why, by the way, large language models still have such a hard time with even some of the most basic grammatical tasks and tests, because they just don't have this symbolic kind of discrete operator system at their root. They have to kind of approximate it from distributional learning mechanisms. So I think, and this kind of speaks to the kind of algebraic properties of natural language. So natural language is non-associative, but it's also commutative. The kind of the merge-based operation of language, whether or not you're a Spanish speaker or an English speaker, you may express the phrase, John went swimming, in different ways. You may put the words in different orders, right? In Italian, you say it one way, and in Mandarin, you say it a different way. But the underlying conceptual space and the abstract relationship between the predicates and the arguments and the events and the entities still have the same representation, same mental representation in conceptual space. But then when you map it to an expression, sign language or speech or whatever, then that's where the complexity comes in. And there's an interesting, going back to your very first question, actually, about what people get wrong about language, there's a really interesting kind of discovery, I think, from the last 15, 20 years. It's kind of a consensus in certain parts of linguistics that most, if not all, of linguistic diversity across the world's languages, most of that diversity is in the morphophonological realm. It's in the space of the sounds and the order of the sounds. It's not in the space of the meanings or the grammar, the grammatical rules, right? And I think that kind of really speaks again to this idea that what is central to language, it's the ability to construct meaning, to construct structured meaning. And then the thing that languages differ on quite a lot is just the way you express it. Some languages use, all sorts of different phonological apparatus and acoustic, motor acoustic types of apparatus to express language. But that's kind of the superficial part of language. And that's not to say it's not a very important part of human nature. It's not an important part of science. It's not an important part of culture. Of course, those things are very, very important. The way we speak is a very important part of who we are. But from a psychological perspective, from an evolutionary perspective, the thing that is kind of central is really this grammatical, semantic ability.
Yeah, it's very interesting that you're in the tradition of Noam Chomsky with this kind of deep grammar in languages that even across different languages, actually, like a lot of that surface level. I don't know why I've encountered this, and maybe I don't know how much I'm interpolating my own memory because I just don't read that much about language, and I haven't talked to many neuroscientists in it, but I've always felt like, people know Chomsky is wrong, and there isn't really something like fundamental to language, like it's like kind of culturally relative, and different cultures like see the world differently. That's the kind of like the things that I've only just in recent readings on it, which is not that much. So yours is kind of a bit different from that, though.
No, it is, yeah. And the funny thing is that it's a bit of a cliche to people to say things like, well, everyone knows Chomsky's been debunked. And people have been saying that for decades. Every decade or so, there's a new New York Times article that says, oh, Chomsky's been debunked. So he's been debunked again. I thought he was debunked 10 years ago. Oh, no. He's really been debunked now, like for real. Why has he been debunked? Because ChatGPT can do funny impressions of Tucker Carlson, right? That's why he's been debunked, or so on. Every year, there's a new kind of reason. No, Chomsky hasn't been debunked. He's very much, alive, and his theories are still very much alive, and his spirit and his kind of philosophy of science are very much alive. But no, it is common to say that. And the reason why it's common to say that is because there's a few reasons. In linguistics and psychology, because it is a science about something so close to us and so intimately connected to our identities and ourselves, it's very common for people to get emotional, and it's common for people to have an urge to rebut and an urge to denounce and disprove. That's a real common human instinct. You find it in other sciences too, sociology, physics to some extent, I guess, but linguistics is very much a science of like, we have to disprove and rebut type of thing. And and some of that is Chomsky's fault, to be fair. Actually, he has a reputation of being a little bit confrontational and a little bit sharp in his rhetoric, but that's the way it is. He is who he is. But I think the reason why people think it's been disproved is often because they don't understand the main argument. So the obvious one is the Pidahar Amazonian language that supposedly didn't have a particular type of recursion, right? But then, of course, you ask the question: do these Amazonian tribes people, can they learn Brazilian Portuguese, right? And they say, yeah, you can. Okay, well, the end of argument then, right? They can still learn the language. They still have the ability to learn a language because they have this merge type compositional operator. And what's funny is that all these so-called non-Chomskyan frameworks often smuggle in a merge type, Chomskyan syntactic operator, but they just don't call it that. They call it something else. Or they pretend that it's not there. But then if you look at the actual formal properties of their theory, you'll find it there. So this is one of the reasons why when I do my neuroscience of language, I'm very keen for people to make explicit what are their formal commitments, right? When you talk about language, what is it that you're talking about? Because it's not good enough to say, I'm going to study the neuroscience of language, and language is just some way of composing meanings. It's like, what does that mean? That's way too vague. It's way too vague. Like when you study attention, working memory, navigation, these guys have very formal, precise configurational descriptions and schemas for what they mean by navigation, right? They can tell you what they mean by navigation. They can mathematically express it algebraically. And I think the same is also needed for language. You can't just say, I'm going to study the neurobiology of language and then just assume it's something to do with sentences, because that's too vague. As I said before, when you do sentence processing, you also do loads of other things too. And there's a kind of a problem in the field where people talk about things like a language localizer task in neuroscience, where you'll get people, you'll scan the brains of people when they do what's called a language localizer. And there's no such thing. There's no one experiment that can just localize language. That's way too overpowered. In the same way, vision scientists don't say there's, or attention scientists or working memory scientists, they don't say there's an attention localizer. Here's this one task that will just isolate attention in the brain. You can't do that. You have to have a series of structured experiments that tease apart different components of language. And the language localizer that's often offered is something that simply contrasts processing sentences with processing lists of words. And yes, the difference there does include language, but it also includes other things too, like I've said a few times today, right? But no, so the arguments against generative grammar and Chomsky have never been particularly successful, which is why they keep coming back, right? The main argument is that there is something biologically innate about human language, right? A lot of people, surprisingly more people than you'd expect, still do believe that, including me. There is something genetically different about me and my young nephew compared to their pet dog or their pet goldfish, right? There is something biologically different. It's not just about culture and exposure. And lots of experiments have shown over the years, some direct experiments, some kind of unintentional natural experiments, accidental experiments, suggesting that just simple exposure to environmental linguistic stimuli is not enough to get you language. But there's a lot of like if I study primate communication systems, it's tempting to then kind of assume that you can make claims and speculations about human language because I've studied primate communication or something. There are people who study whale song and dolphin communication systems that therefore say, well, now I'm licensed, I'm qualified to make speculations about language evolution. I don't know why people feel they're comfortable doing that, because the overlap between whale song and human language is zero. There's nothing in common. There's some statistical properties that are in common, but again, that's a reflex of non-linguistic processes, right? So human language is non-associative, it's commutative, it's recursive, it's digital infinity, it's symbolic, it's discrete. Whale song and primate communication systems are not those things. They don't take any of those formal algebraic properties that I just mentioned. They're totally different beasts. And it would be kind of like saying, if I was a scientist who studied bee dancing, the waggle dance of bees, it would be me like saying, okay, I've written a paper about the waggle dance of bees, therefore I'm now qualified to write a paper about Brazilian breakdancing, and I'm an expert on human dancing just because I've studied how bees dance, right? Like there's no relationship whatsoever. But like I said, I think the reason why people make those mistakes is because they equivocate communication and expression with human language. And it's very common for people to say, "Oh, I think my dog understands language. I think apes understand language. All these other animals actually secretly have language. They just can't express it. And I just don't believe any of that stuff."
Interesting. And tell me more about what you've seen in other animals. So, because I guess you would say, yeah, they don't really have language. There's something much more fundamental and sophisticated about humans. And it's interesting. It reminds me, like you talked at the start about language, kind of bringing together lots of different faculties, like the abstraction, but it's with like physical localization and like. Because I'm almost trying to imagine, what would it be like to be a different animal that like it only had like one or another kind of function, but like it doesn't have that kind of general capacity to kind of have a language, or a way to kind of bring together different functions and make analogies and metaphors across them, right?
Yeah, it's like I think it a lot of people do this, I think, for good intentions. So, for example, I'll just give an example. I'm not an animal person, right? I don't have any pets. I don't have a dog. I don't really want a dog. I don't want a cat. I'm allergic, actually. I'm allergic to cats and dogs, so I can't have them anyway. But even if I wasn't allergic, I wouldn't want a pet. There are other people who are animal lovers. And if you're an animal lover, it is true that the relationship that humans have with dogs, for example, does have a genuine emotional resonance to it. And there is a real psychological even connection between a longly cohabited dog and their owner. That's real. I'm not saying that's not real. It is genuinely like emotional actually sometimes in ways that meet a level of emotional resonance that is distinct from a human to human relationship. Because a human human to relationship, the boundaries, you're on the same level, you can communicate, so you kind of know the score. A human to non-human bond is a very different type of bond, precisely because you're forced to enter this mysterious, inarticulated space of connection and relationship. So it's a very interesting psychological phenomenon. But I think the problem is that a lot of animal lovers, because they love animals, they think that they are doing animals a service and the respect by saying things like, animals are so intelligent, they're conscious, they basically have a language, they're so similar to us, etc. I think it's the opposite. I think it's actually a form of arrogance, because it also conversely prevents you from really seeing the animal mind for what it really is. If you just anthropomorphize animal minds and say, oh, they're just like us, they have language secretly, they have all these sophisticated thoughts and feelings and beliefs, they're just like us. I'm being so respectful. I love animals so much and I respect them so much. I'm going to impose my own human anthropomorphic worldview and biases onto animals. And I think that's actually kind of disrespectful, because there's actually many computational capacities and spaces of representation that animals can do and enter that humans would never be able to possibly even imagine and conceive. And so I think, even though a lot of these people have good intentions of being respectful to animals, it's just not, I don't think it cashes out. It's very similar, actually, if I could maybe make a slightly adjacent point. It kind of reminds me of, when people say things like, all cultures are, equal, all cultures throughout human history, they're all of the same value, all the same, even the ones that did child slavery and child mutilation and sacrifice, and cannibalism, they're all the same. They all have the same value. They're all just different. But making that kind of argument sounds like a very progressive, liberal, tolerant kind of view. But actually, it also conversely prevents you from acknowledging the possibility that other cultures are better than your own, right? If you immediately say all cultures are equal and everyone's the same, then you actually are presupposing that no one else throughout history can be superior in any technological, moral, ethical way from your own view. So it's secretly a form of arrogance, right? So it comes across, it's one of many forms of human behavior and argument that initially come across as very tolerant and sympathetic and progressive, but are secretly arrogant and selfish and regressive. And I think the same is true of these animal language arguments, right? You're saying that animals have language because it makes you feel like you're being sympathetic and loving and caring. But really, you're just preventing cognitive science and ethologists from really truly exploring the endogenous properties of non-human creatures who have a landscape and worldview that is just as interesting and relevant and important. It just doesn't have language, and that's okay. It's okay that animals don't have language.
Yeah, it makes me think, like earlier I wanted to bring up the point, because we're contrasting language with, say, other faculties like emotions, and how in some ways actually with emotions and bodily cues, and like we actually give more away more clearly in our bodies, right? And so if you wanted like completely honest communication, like look at someone sweating or someone, they can't really fake like higher heart rate and things. But with language, yeah, like on the one hand we can communicate something way more sophisticated with language, but as you said, we actually can also deceive with language. Like it's also like a tool that like can but that's interesting, because that makes me think of like human communication and the way in which then when one's engaging with a human versus say a dog, on one level, okay, maybe it's really nice with a dog, like you both really like the dog has some like extra like sensory and smell and things which actually can connect more deeply with you. I don't know more, but it's different. But it's honest. Like you're not really entering into that relationship where like if you enter into a relationship with someone with language, they can actually deceive you with it then, right? Like they could really know you. I mean, this has happened to people probably, right? You can actually be betrayed with language then. Like you can really know someone and it literally sounds like precisely what they're saying. Like it has a sophisticated meaning. They wouldn't lie. That's like, but then they could slightly, because language actually, you're able to do that with that, and like dogs, I assume can't. So
Yeah. Yeah, it kind of goes back to what Dawkins argued, as I said, right? Like he in the paper that I cited before, he has this specific line where he says, "Look, any organism, including humans, that express anything, that say anything, they're doing it for their own desires and goals, right? So anytime any human being says anything, they're doing it with a potentially selfish goal in mind, right? For self-preservation, for my own gain, short-term, long-term gain, right? It's very, 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 very rare that people will say things in arguments or conversations that are genuinely 100% self-sacrificial and don't bring them any benefit or any self-benefit, right? So this entire podcast, for example, I've been saying things to you that make me look clever, right? Like I haven't been saying things that make me look stupid, I hope. Maybe I did. If I did say things that make me look stupid, I didn't do it intentionally, right? I'm not trying to look stupid, right? But that's not just true of podcasts. It's true of every conversation you have, right? You're trying to say things that, well, first of all, it's kind of similar. Excuse me. It's similar to the way that social media is often used by people for kind of performative identity formation purposes, right? Like you use your social media account to kind of externally mold and shape the identity that you kind of want. Is it necessarily truthful? Are you really, being genuine? No, almost definitely not, right? But even with things like, asking people for directions or asking people for advice or asking people for the time, like tiny things like that, any form of so-called communicative expressive act is going to be done with some kind of self-model in mind, right? So this goes back to Friston's ideas of we all have some kind of general model of reality and a model of the world. And the brain's main goal is to update that world model as little as possible, right? You want to update your world model as little as possible. That's better for energy expenditure. It's better for your stabilized world perception. Often helps you with predictions too, right? And you know what to predict, you know what not to predict. Even if those predictions are violated, at least you have a stable set of frames to things to predict and not predict. And it's the same with self-models, right? It's evolutionarily, again, I don't want to do the whole evolutionary psychology thing of like just using the word evolution to explain things, but like it's probably evolutionarily beneficial to have a stable self-model. And often in patients who have psychosis or various states of non-neurotypical psychological formation, or whatever you want to describe it as, that's primarily diagnosed by a non-stable self-model, right? And people who have the most stable self-models are often highly problematic because they're inflexible to revision. At the same time, though, people who are totally flexible in their self-models are also a problem, because if you change your opinion about who you are every day, that's not good, right? You got to have a nice sweet spot between being flexible and inflexible in your world model. Same with the world model too, not just self-model, and that's what defines a good scientist. And Friston always has this idea that being a human with a brain is about being a mini scientist, right? The human brain is basically a mini scientist. It's trying to figure things out and test things and explore the world, etc. But yeah, I think that overlaps closely with language, though, for the reasons that you said. Yeah.
We've touched on that many times, but I want to get deeply into AI and then what it doesn't get about language, and you kind of criticize that if you do next token prediction, it doesn't understand it, particularly because I guess also a lot of the time we're going in and we're okay, there's the model, but then we know as humans that it's kind of like what good language will look like, so we can go and tweak stuff. But then like, what was the AI intrinsically getting, and what did we kind of know? Oh yeah, there's some rules that will like generally help it form better sentences.
Yeah, that's a good question. Human intelligence, what defines human intelligence is doing more with less, right? You have a very limited set of rules and facts and computational abilities, and you can do more with that limited thing. Large language models do more with more, right? They don't do more with less, they do more with more. So that's not intelligence. Like if you have you're standing outside the British Museum and you're a UCL professor, and you're going to hire a new mathematics PhD student, and you have two students that you can potentially hire, and you say, look, I need you to calculate the height of the British Museum. And the first person says, oh, I know the answer because I read it on Wikipedia yesterday, got the answer. The second student says, I actually don't know the answer, but I know that if I measure the length of the shadow at noon and I compare the length of the shadow of the museum with the length of my shadow and your shadow, I can do some kind of basic math, and I can figure out more or less. I won't give you the exact answer, but I'll give you a pretty good answer. Who are you going to hire for the job? Obviously, you're going to hire the guy who uses their brain, right? You're not going to hire the person who just knows the answer because they read it in a book or read it on Wikipedia. The problem with large language models is that they can't do the latter, right? They only regurgitate stuff that they've been exposed to, and even then, they hallucinate, right? Even when they are being tasked with regurgitation, they often don't do a very good job. They are purely, well, there's a few things to say here. They're not purely deep learning, connectionist models. They actually have smuggled in a lot of symbolic kind of, rule-based systems, like obvious ones like guardrails, and also the ChatGPT kind of coding assistant, Python assistant thing. That's a kind of case of a rule-based, fixed, discrete symbolic system being plugged in to an otherwise deep learning architecture. But no, you can't approximate and guess the rules of grammar. Like I said before, right, it's been known since the 1950s that grammatical rules are independent from surface statistics. So if your large language model is just trained on all the text on the internet, it will approximate what look like grammatical rules sometimes, but that's just an illusion. They look like grammatical rules in the same way that humans often think that they're talking to a real human being when they're talking to ChatGPT. It's an illusion that we impose on sensory data, right? In this case, the internet and ChatGPT. It's just another convenient way for us to anthropomorphize, which is why I'm really not a fan of the term artificial intelligence in this respect. Not in principle, but just when applied to large language models. They're not a form of intelligence. And so we shouldn't call them artificial intelligence. And they're also not large language models because they're not language models. And they're not large, they're ginormous. So we have to be very careful with the terminology that we, and this goes back to a very basic lesson, again from Professor Chomsky, right? One of his lessons is, interrogate names. Whatever name something is given to itself or by something else, interrogate it. Is it really X, right? So when a country behaves in a certain way and it describes itself as X, is it really behaving as X? When OpenAI calls itself AI, is it really AI? It's kind of basic logic just to question, are these things X? But I think it goes back to what we talked about earlier, the anthropomorphization. We're so eager and keen to think of ChatGPT as thinking or understanding. What does it mean for a large language model to understand anything? If you can't explain what it means for a large language model to understand something, then you can't. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me rephrase that. If you can't explain what it means for a large language model not to understand something, then you can't really clearly explain what it means to understand something. And we clearly have no definition of what it means for a large language model not to get X, Y, Z.
Some of your presentations, do you have some examples about your interesting conversations with AI? Like I think that it didn't really understand the old men and women, right? The ways you could pass that sentence as the old men and woman, or the old men. The old men and woman.
There are some cases that I gave it like that, where the nature of the structural ambiguities are not clear to it. So there was a case that I gave it a while ago. The mechanic who fixed the car carefully packed his tools, right? So that's an example where carefully can modify forward or backwards, right? He could pack his tools carefully, or he could carefully fix the car. So it's structurally ambiguous. There's no way around that, right? The mechanic who packed his tools carefully fixed the car, right? Carefully can mean two different things. And ChatGPT doesn't get that. And I probed it on a number of similar cases. And the reason why is because, and interesting, if you probe its logic and its reasoning is almost always distributional based, which is a kind of a bit of a giveaway. Its reasoning is always, oh, people would never say this. It's not common for people to say this. People don't usually say this, right? That's not a scientific explanation. That's not a reason, right? Based on frequency. Frequency is just frequency. It's not a print. Like, information theory is fantastic, and the reason why information theory, Shannon theoretic, information theory is so successful is because it's been applied so broadly across the sciences. But it's a tool, right? It's a useful tool that you can use if you want to. It's not in principle leading to a scientific explanation just because you're classifying things using very sophisticated distributional statistics. And so I think that's kind of a tell, right? ChatGPT just doesn't, again, I hate to anthropomorphize it myself, but it doesn't see or it doesn't understand that these are rules. That's not part of its world model.
On the importance of language, and then it's like the sophistication of the way we use it, do you think there could be something more than language, like an even greater capacity for synthesizing together different things? Like, is there something like, I mean, I don't know. I mean, on the one hand, like people like John Vervaeke, I really like, who talk about kind of with language, you can also sort of then you can use it to have shared attention. Like we can sort of build off of each other, sort of like in the moment. I mean, we obviously do it across time as well with science and culture and stuff, but such that actually we genuinely can get to the contours of like reality or like what idea we have, and we can sort of progress, like not in just like we point to some object in the world, but like we genuinely come closer to the world through it. But then perhaps there could be some other greater capacity, like I don't know what that would be, but yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, it's so if you think about what language is at its basis, it's this super simple elementary ability to combine units together into phrases, right? Structured representations. That's actually a simpler computation than what non-human primates do. Their computation of concatenation, linear concatenation, is actually computationally more sophisticated because it requires additional tools. So language is paradoxically a simpler computation than so-called more primitive communication and conceptual systems, right? So, and yet simultaneously, when you map that language capacity to all these different previously encapsulated cognitive modules, then you get the full expressive power of Shakespeare and James Joyce. But the question is, what could come after that potentially? I think that would depend on not so much the computation, but I think where you connect that computation with other modules. So, for example, the human language faculty is not particularly sensitive or hooked up for whatever reason to the visual processing, right? So, it's common for languages to grammatically mark tense, past, future, etc. So temporal information, time. But I don't know of any languages that morphologically, grammatically mark visual, like color, right? Like color is all around us. Like color is such an important, salient feature of human perception, and yet it's not a linguistic feature. We have words for colors, but they're individual nouns: blue, gray, green. But we don't have syntactic operations that are color sensitive, right? And there's a neurological explanation for this, which is the parts of the brain that the language faculty is hooked up to and close to, like the arcuate fasciculus, for example, posterior arcuate fasciculus, posterior temporal to frontal and parietal. It just doesn't crisscross over striate cortex. It doesn't crisscross over even higher visual cortices. So that's potentially why the language system just doesn't have all that much to say about color. So if you're asking like what comes after language, I guess a more powerful system than human language would just be something that can compositionally structure a broader range of representations than what we currently express. So like I said, there seems to be something human unique about the way we have our particular type of music, mathematics, morality, and language, because those are all structured symbolic domains. Morality is a good example, actually, because it maps very closely to content words, right? We make moral judgments based on who does what to whom and when, right? Agents and patients and objects and locations. That very closely mirrors the kind of grammar of human language. And so I think with the emergence of language, you get a more precise and refined moral judgment, right? You can make more sophisticated moral judgments because you can make more sophisticated structured symbolic representation. You can make more sophisticated music. You can make more sophisticated mathematical arguments too. In fact, most of mathematics was not discovered until the last 300-400 years or so, right? It's been dormant. It's been lying dormant, like waiting to be accessed, right? And I think it's possible that there are other cognitive capacities that humans have that are also still dormant but haven't been tapped into yet. Again, if you go back 500 years, all of 20th century physics, maths, and linguistics, and computer science, and recursive function theory, etc., all of that is completely alien. It's like it would be like speaking to a person from a different planet. All of those things, right? And so, but crucially, these are all seemingly human unique functions, right? There seem to be a lot of these human unique functions, but they all have certain things in common. They are structured, symbolic forms of reasoning and inference, right? We have individual representations, and you can compose them into larger units. That seems to be the core common feature.
It's kind of longer than I normally do it, but just a few more things. I mean, one is like,
Sure.
You talked about how we could get language in the first place. Like you said, one person, or kind of can't be gradual, right? So when and how does it come about? Yeah, I mean, I've had actually talk to someone who kind of argued like it must have come about, but not. It did. They had a different kind of perspective on language than you, and so they thought it kind of had to come about in like a unique social situation, where you kind of first can sort of like, think about this object and like have a shared like verbal thing, like this means that, and everyone kind of had their attention on it or something. But yeah, I wonder what your story would be for that.
So that may well have been one of the ways in which particular forms of the artifacts of language were triggered. But that's not the same thing as the mechanism of language itself, right? So there's a difference. This is a big problem in computer science and linguistics, actually, because when people talk about recursion, they often confuse the mechanism of recursion, right, with its artifacts and its products. It's the same of language. People confuse the mechanism of language with its products, right? The products of language are indeed text and complicated forms of reasoning, but that's not the same thing as the underlying mechanism, right? So people equate recursion with like self-embedding or whatever. These are not recursion is related to self-embedding, but it's not necessarily the same thing. Right? Same with language too. Language is often related to these sorts of inferences that you're talking about, but they're not necessarily the same thing. I think it is true though that a more complex world would have triggered and called upon these dormant computational capacities. That's definitely true. There are clearly external pressures for accessing that faculty of language, but I don't think there's a funny quote from David Lightfoot, a professor at Georgetown University, who said, in linguistic theory, there's something called the subjacency principle, which is basically just certain rules and constraints about how words can relate to each other in sentences, broadly speaking. And he said the subjacency principle is a wonderful thing, but it probably didn't increase your chances of having more fruitful sex, right? It's like a formal principle, a design principle of human language. Did it have any sexual selectional advantage? Probably not. It seems to be a weird quirk of language that is just part of the formal design features of language. There are other properties of language that would have had sexual selectional advantages, but probably not the rules of grammar. It's possible that going way back as far as we can, as early as we can do, right? Mutations happen in individuals, right? There's a particular individual who has a particular neural rewiring that affords, for the first time, the ability to compose internally recursively discrete, unbounded structures, right? The question is, what are their representations that they're constructing? Today, we have what we call nouns and verbs and qualities and so on. Way back when, the capacity for digital infinity may only have mapped to a more restricted set of elements, conceptual elements. And then I have a paper in language evolution in 2019 where I talk about like the possible timeline of which other faculties this merge type capacity would then interface with. Maybe first it was music, and then morality, and then maybe finally it helped boost and enhance mathematics too. So it's not as if language evolved and then suddenly everything else did too. It just means you have this small primitive capacity, and then it was interfaced and connected with other things. So that's kind of the way I see it. But also, crucially, that would have had selectional advantages too, though, because the ability to think more complex thoughts, right, and plan and strategize and make more complex inferences and combine representations together that have never been combined before, that would have had selectional advantages, because that individual clearly would have been more likely to survive and thrive than an individual without that internal capacity, even if their ability to express it in a complex form of what we would call language did not come about, for tens and tens of thousands of years later. But like I said, the last thing I would say on this though is I always have to try and caution people away from evolutionary scenarios that are rational and logical in terms of if you were in this situation, X would have been advantage. You got to separate that from the actual formal design principles of the system in question. In this case, it's this capacity for digital infinity and recursion and self-call and phrase structure and all that kind of stuff, right? That sort of thing is completely separate from the 10, 12, 20, 30, 40 different scenarios that we can imagine that would have been advantageous for an individual with those features. And then the very final thing I'd say is just the sheer rapidity with which cultural explosions happen in language. In human beings. What's called the Great Leap Forward in evolution, right? The last 10 years there's been some pushback on the Great Leap Forward, like a certain slightly more gradualist perspective on certain cultural artifacts that may have encapsulated this, and that's a valid point to make. But I think overall there is still enough evidence that there was some clear phase transition in human intelligence that was rapid enough in evolutionary timescales. Rapid meaning not on the order of 10 or 20 years, on the order of like tens of thousands of years. But that's still rapid enough for it to license a non-gradualist explanation for how language emerged.
So do you think language came about in humans, although the sort of prerequisites were kind of maybe in our ancestors, but and it wasn't the last, like when, I mean, it's hard to give a date, but you think kind of like it's about previous like tens of thousands of years and like human culture and civilization? You think it's related with that?
Yeah, I do. I think the usual date that I give is 200,000 years or so ago, right? That's when, or maybe 150,000 years ago. And then I think it's not an accident that you get these cultural products of the main thing is, this is an interesting conversation because it's not just language that we have to think about here. There's language on the one hand, but then there's also a separate capacity that people like John Krakauer at Johns Hopkins University have talked quite a lot about. And that's the capacity for representational thinking, just the capacity to think in abstract, symbolic, representational terms. That's not the same thing as structured, recursive, symbolic thinking, right? So you get the Lascaux paintings, right, in France, these beautiful cave paintings of animals and agents and things like that, right? Scenes and that's clearly a symbolic form of representational thinking. It's not necessarily linguistic though, right? Not necessarily linguistic. It's just there are things happening. I think it likely is driven by language, by the way, but there's no necessary connection. And we know from a lot of neuropsychological work that the capacity for representational thinking is definitely distinct from language. If you have language deficits and you lose your capacity for the language, again, we've already had this conversation, but to whatever extent you can truly lose your language, representational thinking still can remain very much intact, right? People don't lose that. I mean, that's really the one thing that you really don't ever lose. It's very difficult to lose purely representational symbolic thinking.
What would you mean by that?
So like an arbitrary set of lines on the whiteboard or circles or shapes that you can connect to an invariant environment, independent, discrete mental entity, right? Whether that's an emotion or a number or an entity or an event or a property or a quality or a fact, even a proposition. You could, so for example, stop signs. That just means the physical stop sign on the road is a different entity from the English phrase stop sign. The noun phrase a stop sign is a linguistic entity. The physical stop sign is a physical stop sign, means something different. It's not quite the same thing, right? There are subtle differences between those the representational thinking and the kind of linguistic. I mean, I guess
Yeah.
the stop sign literally has the word stop on, so it's not a very good example. But if you could imagine a stop sign without the word stop on, it's still
It would still refer to the thing and the act that you kind of know what it means.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that really does seem to be a if not uniquely human capacity, the representational thing, certainly substantially enhanced in humans. The capacity for the ways in which humans create art and express ourselves and understand ourselves through literature and film and poetry and art and sculpture and so on. And that's clearly, orders of magnitude more powerful and expressive a landscape than the ways that even Neanderthal putatively designed jewelry and necklaces and things like that. It's a completely different landscape.
Thank you. This has been really fun.
Yeah, awesome. Likewise.
Any way you want to point people? What would you like to say in the end?
I have a website. You guys can check out some of my papers. I've pretty much always put my papers as freely accessible, like PDFs, including all my books. They're always like free as well. The PDFs on my website. I guess that's all I'd say. And the last thing I would say is my general call to action is anybody studying language, whether it's in the brain or in machines or in your own private life, take seriously those formal algebraic, like mathematical properties of language, because they really are kind of the core feature of what we're trying to explore and express. And all the other parts of language are kind of more superficial and typically less human specific. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay.
Awesome. Thanks, Jack.